Thomas Malthus, the grim math that terrified an era and the question that refuses to die. Our thinker today is famous for being wrong, spectacularly, provably wrong about the future of human civilization. And yet economists, ecologists, and climate scientists still argue about him constantly, in 2026, as if the argument were not settled at all.
That tension is the whole reason Thomas Malthus is worth understanding properly instead of dismissing with a punchline.
Set up the argument for us, because it is genuinely simple math, which is part of why it hit people so hard.
Malthus published an essay on the principle of population in 1798, and the core claim is almost embarrassingly simple to state. Population, left unchecked, tends to grow geometrically, doubling and doubling. Food supply, even with real agricultural improvement, tends to grow only arithmetically, adding roughly steady increments. Run those two curves forward and population inevitably outpaces food, again and again. And Malthus argued that gap gets closed the hard way, famine, disease, or war, unless people voluntarily restrain their own reproduction first. That grinding, repeating collision between population and resources became known as the Malthusian trap.
And this landed on a very specific, very tense moment in British intellectual life.
It did. Malthus was writing partly against the more utopian optimists of his era, thinkers like William Godwin, who imagined ongoing human progress and rational planning could eventually eliminate poverty and want almost entirely. Malthus, an ordained clergyman as well as an economist, thought that vision was dangerously naive, that scarcity was baked into the basic biology of population growth itself, no matter how cleverly society organized production.
Now, the honest historical case against Malthus is enormous, because the population catastrophe he predicted simply did not happen the way he described.
It really did not, and this is worth stating plainly rather than softening. World population has grown roughly eightfold since Malthus wrote, and for the vast majority of people on Earth, food availability, life expectancy, and material living standards have improved dramatically over that same period, not collapsed. Malthus fundamentally underestimated how much technology could expand food production. He had no way to anticipate industrial fertilizer, mechanized farming, or the genuine scientific revolution in crop yields, still a century and a half away when he was writing.
That revolution has a name, and it deserves its own moment here as the historical rebuttal.
The Green Revolution, mainly in the mid-20th century, driven by plant scientists like Norman Borlaug, developing dramatically higher yield varieties of wheat and rice, alongside expanded irrigation and synthetic fertilizer, is arguably the single most direct historical refutation of Malthus's specific prediction. Countries that were widely expected to face mass famine, India prominent among them, instead saw grain production surge dramatically within just a few decades, feeding populations far larger than anything Malthus's original arithmetic would have thought survivable. It is a genuinely inspiring story of human ingenuity, outrunning a grim mathematical prediction, and it deserves to be told that way.
And yet there is a darker historical case study too, where Malthusian thinking did real, direct harm.
The Irish famine of the 1840s is the essential, painful example, and it is essential precisely because it shows what happens when Malthusian logic gets absorbed uncritically into actual policy. Large parts of the British administrative response to the famine were shaped by an assumption, influenced by Malthusian thinking circulating at the time, that mass suffering was a somewhat natural, even necessary check on an overgrown population, and that extensive government relief might simply delay an inevitable and even useful correction. That framing contributed to a relief response many historians now judge as catastrophically inadequate relative to the scale of suffering, while food continued to be exported out of Ireland during the worst of the crisis. Malthus himself died before the famine and cannot be blamed personally for British policy decisions made in his name, but the case remains a stark historical warning about what happens when a population theory gets treated as a justification for inaction rather than a problem to actively solve.
So Malthus was wrong about the big prediction, and his logic could be actively dangerous when misapplied. Why are we still talking about him at all?
Because the underlying logical structure, finite resources colliding with growth, has not actually disappeared, it has just kept relocating to new resources. Modern neo-Malthusian arguments do not usually claim we will run out of food in the old, literal sense. They apply the same basic collision to climate stability, fresh water, arable land, and critical minerals, arguing that continued economic and population growth is on a collision course with genuinely finite planetary limits. And their critics respond with essentially the same rebuttal that defeated the original Malthus, that human ingenuity, substitution, and technological innovation have repeatedly moved the ceiling higher than pessimists expected, and there is no obvious reason that pattern must suddenly stop now.
Which makes this a genuinely live, unresolved argument, not a settled historical curiosity.
Completely unresolved, and reasonable, serious people land on very different sides of it. Climate change and resource scarcity, debates happening right now, in 2026, are essentially a live rerun of the Malthus versus Green Revolution argument, just with carbon and water stress standing in for wheat and rice. Some serious voices argue current trajectories genuinely risk real Malthusian-style limits on food and water security in specific vulnerable regions within decades. Others argue, pointing to the historical record of Malthus consistently being outrun by innovation, that continued investment in technology, from drought-resistant crops to desalination to clean energy, will do for climate limits roughly what the Green Revolution did for food. Nobody gets to declare victory in that argument from history alone. It genuinely depends on choices being made right now.
Give us the everyday version, something that makes the actual mathematical shape of this click without needing a chart.
Picture a household budget that grows in a steady, predictable straight line each year. A small, reliable raise, the same modest increase every single year. Now picture that same household's appetite for spending growing exponentially instead. A new subscription this year, then two more next year, then a bigger apartment, then more of everything, compounding rather than simply adding. For a while the gap feels small and manageable. Then almost suddenly, it does not, and the family is quietly and then not so quietly underwater. That gap between arithmetic growth and geometric growth is the entire Malthusian trap, just shrunk down from a planet to a kitchen table.
There is also a genuinely important personal dimension to Malthus worth including, his friendship with Ricardo.
One of the great intellectual friendships in the history of economics, and it is a model worth holding onto. Malthus and Ricardo disagreed constantly and substantively on population, on trade, on the causes of economic downturns, exchanging letters for years that are still studied today for the sheer quality of the argument on both sides. And by every account, they remain genuinely close, warm friends throughout, each publicly acknowledging how much the other's criticism sharpened his own thinking. Ricardo reportedly said he never loved anyone outside his own family as much as he loved Malthus, despite disagreeing with him about nearly everything in economics. That is a strikingly rare and rather wonderful example of serious intellectual combat without personal contempt.
It is worth noting Malthus revised his own thinking too, which does not fit the caricature of a rigid pessimist frozen in 1798.
Later editions of his essay soften the original argument considerably, giving much more weight to what he called moral restraint, people voluntarily delaying marriage and childbearing, as a real and humane check on population growth, rather than leaving the correction entirely to famine and disease. That is a meaningfully different Malthus than the one usually quoted, someone actually updating his own theory in response to criticism, which is more intellectual flexibility than his popular reputation tends to give him credit for.
So what is the honest, complicated verdict on Malthus after all this?
He was wrong about the specific timeline and the specific mechanism, badly wrong, and that mistake had real, painful consequences when it hardened into policy during the Irish famine. But the deeper structural question he raised, whether growth of any kind can permanently outrun the resources that sustain it, was never actually answered once and for all. It was simply outrun, repeatedly, by human ingenuity, which is not the same thing as being permanently disproven. The honest, motivating reason to study Malthus is that his failure is not a reason to stop asking his question. It is a reminder that the answer has always depended on what people actually chose to invent and build next.
Which brings us to a thinker who tried to take the entire tradition we have covered so far, Smith's markets, Ricardo's trade, even a little of Malthus's grim realism, and civilize it, soften its harder edges without abandoning its core logic.
Someone who cared just as much about individual liberty as any thinker in this series, and pushed it in some genuinely surprising, progressive directions for his era.
Next time, John Stuart Mill, and the philosopher who tried to prove that liberty and social reform could actually strengthen each other instead of pulling apart. See you then.